What if the most important chapter of human history is missing? Not destroyed, not erased, simply never acknowledged. If humanity is as old as the evidence suggests, then one question becomes impossible to ignore. Why does our story begin so late? The familiar narrative unfolds with confidence. Humans wander the land. Humans hunt, adapt, and survive. Then, almost without warning, they build cities. They invent writing. They formalize law, religion, mathematics, and memory itself. Civilization appears structured and self-assured, as though it had been waiting just beyond the edge of recorded time. But before that moment, there is a vast quiet, an expanse so large it resists intuition. A stretch of time measured not in centuries, but in tens of thousands of years. During this period, humans lived, migrated, mastered landscapes, and endured dramatic environmental change, yet left behind remarkably little that resembles the complexity that would later define them. Archaeologists do not deny this gap. It is often described as a long prelude, a necessary buildup before the emergence of civilization. Small, mobile groups, simple technologies, limited social organization. A slow, patient climb toward an inevitable outcome. And yet, inevitability is precisely what troubles some researchers, because the transition does not appear gradual, it appears abrupt. In the archaeological record, complexity does not gently accumulate. It arrives. Settlements become dense. Architecture acquires symbolic meaning. Art shifts toward abstraction. Systems of belief, governance, and shared identity appear with little visible experimentation preserved beneath them. The ground beneath civilization does not slope upward. It drops away. Below it lies not a clear developmental staircase, but absence. Stone tools persist with minimal variation across enormous spans of time. Habitation sites emerge and vanish without clear continuity. Entire regions show long-term human presence, yet almost no accumulation of durable material culture. Generations seem to pass without leaving the kind of residue later societies would produce effortlessly. This absence is usually interpreted as simplicity, a world in which early humans had no need for permanence, no reason to build beyond the moment, no impulse to reshape their environment in lasting ways. But that explanation depends on a crucial assumption, that early humans lacked the capacity for more. Evidence suggests otherwise. These were not cognitively fragile beings drifting through existence. They navigated extreme climates. They crossed open water. They coordinated complex hunts. They remembered landscapes across seasons and generations. Survival demanded foresight, communication, and shared understanding. Such abilities rarely exist without structure. They imply teaching systems, social memory, cultural continuity, and systems, even modest ones, tend to leave traces, which raises an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the early human world was not empty of complexity, but organized in ways that did not fossilize well, built from materials that decay, structured around movement rather than permanence, preserved in mines instead of monuments. Or perhaps something else is missing entirely. Archaeology is a science of survival. Stone endures, bone endures, fired clay endures. But wood rots, fiber dissolves, landscapes flood, erode, and disappear. Coastlines shift, rivers vanish. Entire habitats are rewritten by time. If early human life favored environments now lost, coasts now submerged, forests long gone, or traditions never carved into stone, then vast portions of that world may have vanished without protest. The silence beneath the timeline may not indicate an absence of history. It may reflect the limits of what can survive long enough to be found. And that realization leads to a deeper, more troubling question. If our earliest chapters are largely unreadable, how certain can we be about where civilization truly begins? Because when civilization finally appears, it does not resemble a first attempt. It looks practiced. And that impression lingers, quietly, persistently, beneath the timeline we have learned to trust. What if the silence is not where the story starts, but where it was interrupted? The difficulty is not that archaeologists are unaware of this silence. It is that the silence resists explanation. In most historical sequences, complexity leaves a trail. Early versions are crude, mistakes are visible, techniques improve unevenly, failures accumulate alongside successes. Progress, when traced backward, usually frays. But when researchers examine the threshold of civilization, that fraying is strangely absent. The earliest cities do not look like experiments. They are not tentative clusters that collapse and retry. They appear organized from the outset, aligned, planned, socially coordinated. Writing systems emerge already capable of abstraction. Symbolic art appears mature, not hesitant. Religious structures suggest shared cosmology rather than improvisation. Some scholars describe this as a compression of development, many changes happening quickly due to population density or environmental pressure. Others are less certain, because even rapid change usually leaves debris. What troubles researchers is not the speed of transformation, but the lack of visible preparation beneath it. If complexity was building slowly over millennia, where is the scaffolding? Stone tools show only incremental shifts. Settlements before cities remain sparse and transient. There is little evidence of large-scale planning, long-term architecture, or durable institutions leading up to the sudden bloom. This absence has produced an uncomfortable methodological problem. Archaeology relies on continuity. It assumes that what comes later is built upon what came before, and that the record will, at least partially, reflect that process. But what if the process did not rely on permanence? What if early complexity was portable? Some anthropologists suggest that early human societies may have invested heavily in social bonds, memory, and oral transmission rather than architecture. Knowledge could have been embedded in ritual, movement, song, and seasonal migration. Authority might have rested in elders rather than structures. Identity may have been carried, not built. Such systems can be extraordinarily sophisticated and extraordinarily fragile. They leave little behind when disrupted. A flood does not erase a stone wall, but it erases a forest camp without protest. A rising sea preserves nothing of shoreline communities. A shift in climate can scatter populations and fracture memory in a single generation. This raises another contradiction. The end of the last ice age was not gentle. Sea levels rose dramatically, coastlines vanished, rivers changed course, entire ecological zones disappeared. Human populations were forced to adapt rapidly or move. If early complexity existed primarily in regions now submerged, then the archaeological record would present exactly what we see today: a long silence followed by sudden appearance inland. Not because civilization began there, but because that is where evidence finally survives. Still, this explanation does not satisfy everyone, because it assumes that all earlier complexity was made of perishable things. And yet, humans later demonstrated a clear impulse to mark, to build, to endure. Why wait? Why would a species capable of symbolic thought, long-term planning, and environmental mastery avoid durable expression for so long, only to embrace it almost simultaneously across different regions? Researchers cannot fully explain this shift. Some attribute it to population thresholds, others to climate stability, others to social stress that demanded new forms of organization. Each explanation addresses part of the problem. None resolves the gap. What remains is a structural anomaly in the human story. A long period of demonstrated cognitive ability with limited material complexity, followed by a sudden surge of symbolic, architectural, and social systems that feel disproportionate to what comes before. It is here, at this fracture point, that speculation is most tempting. But the evidence demands restraint. All that can be said with confidence is this: the archaeological record does not show a smooth ascent into civilization. It shows a discontinuity, a pause, a silence, and then a reappearance of humanity in a form that seems already familiar with complexity. Whether that familiarity was newly discovered, rapidly assembled, or partially remembered remains unresolved. And that uncertainty leads forward, not backward. Because if the foundations of civilization are incomplete, then the chapters that follow may not represent a beginning at all. They may represent the visible portion of a much longer story, one whose earliest pages no longer exist. Or worse, one whose earliest pages were never meant to last. And if that is true, then the gap before civilization is not a mystery of time, but a mystery of disappearance. Long before the first city walls were raised, long before the first symbols were pressed into clay, humans already looked like us. Evidence indicates that anatomically modern humans existed far earlier than the accepted dawn of civilization. Their skeletal remains show bodies adapted for endurance, dexterity, and long-distance travel. Their brains, by size and structure, were indistinguishable from those of people living today. By all biological measures, they were ready. And yet, for an astonishing length of time, they appear to do very little with that readiness, at least in ways the archaeological record can clearly confirm. This disconnect has shaped modern assumptions about early humanity. It is often said that while humans were anatomically modern, they were not yet behaviorally modern. That something essential, symbolism, creativity, abstraction, had not fully emerged. But this explanation raises an immediate problem. Behavior does not exist in isolation from anatomy. A brain capable of language, planning, and imagination does not remain dormant without cause. In every documented context, when such capacities exist, they express themselves, sometimes subtly, sometimes explosively. Yet here, they seem restrained. Early humans crossed vast distances, adapting to deserts, forests, mountains, and frozen tundra. They tracked animal migrations with precision. They selected raw materials and transported them across landscapes. They coordinated hunts that required timing, communication, and shared intent. These are not simple behaviors. They demand anticipation, cooperation, and memory, often across generations. Such abilities suggest that early humans were already thinking symbolically, even if that symbolism is difficult to detect archaeologically. To plan for a seasonal hunt is to imagine a future that does not yet exist. To pass down survival knowledge is to preserve abstract information beyond the individual. These are the building blocks of culture. And yet, when researchers search for material confirmation of this culture, they encounter restraint rather than expression. For tens of thousands of years, artistic artifacts remain rare. Burials with symbolic objects appear sporadically, then disappear again. Complex tools emerge, then stagnate. Innovations arrive unevenly, without clear momentum. It is as though cognitive potential is present, but selectively applied. This selective expression troubles simple evolutionary explanations. If symbolic thinking offered survival advantages, why would it remain largely invisible for so long? Why would a species capable of abstraction not externalize it more consistently through art, architecture, or durable markers of identity? Some archaeologists argue that early symbolic behavior was fragile, easily erased, and rare. Others suggest it existed continuously, but in forms that do not preserve well. Still others propose a more cautious view, that what we are seeing is not absence of behavior, but absence of recognition. That modern observers may be mistaking unfamiliar expressions of intelligence for simplicity. If early humans organized meaning through movement, landscape, and memory rather than objects, then much of their behavior would leave little trace. A ritual performed on a hilltop leaves no artifact once the participants are gone. A song encoding navigation dissolves with its last singer. A boundary remembered by generations leaves nothing to excavate. Such behaviors would appear archaeologically as silence. And that silence has consequences. Because it allows a dangerous assumption to persist, that intelligence emerged suddenly, rather than being long present and quietly practiced. If that assumption is wrong, then the gap before civilization does not reflect cognitive limitation. It reflects a different way of being human, one that does not align with our expectation that complexity must always harden into stone. And that realization reframes the question entirely. Perhaps early humans were not waiting to become modern. Perhaps they already were. So why does their behavior seem to vanish from the record, just when it should be most visible? The contradiction emerges quietly, then refuses to go away. If anatomically modern humans possessed the same neurological potential as people today, then the prolonged absence of visible symbolic culture becomes difficult to reconcile. In every known context, when humans have the capacity for abstraction, they use it. They tell stories. They mark identity. They externalize memory. Yet across vast stretches of early human history, those expressions appear intermittent, faint, or entirely absent from the material record. Researchers attempt to resolve this by separating anatomy from behavior, suggesting that biology arrived first and culture followed much later. But this separation is increasingly questioned. Cognitive abilities are not isolated switches that turn on after millennia of delay. They develop, express, and reinforce themselves through use. Planning a hunt, teaching a child, remembering a seasonal route, these are already acts of symbolic thought. They rely on imagined futures, shared meaning, and collective memory. This raises a subtle but profound anomaly. Early humans demonstrate behaviors that require abstraction, yet they rarely leave behind abstract objects. The implication is not that symbolism was absent, but that it was expressed differently. Meaning may have been embedded in actions rather than artifacts, in movement rather than monuments. Knowledge could have lived in sequences, not structures. Identity may have been tied to landscape, not location. Such systems are effective, but they are vulnerable. When disrupted, they leave almost nothing behind. Climate instability, population displacement, and environmental transformation would have fractured these fragile networks repeatedly. Each disruption could erase generations of accumulated knowledge without leaving a trace for archaeologists to recover. What survives, then, would be only what happened to be repeated later under more stable conditions. This possibility complicates another assumption, that the emergence of visible culture marks the birth of symbolic thought. It may instead mark the moment symbolism became materially anchored, forced outward by changing circumstances, increasing population density, or the loss of older memory systems. In this view, early humans were not behaviorally absent, they were behaviorally invisible. And invisibility can be mistaken for absence. The archaeological record, limited by what endures, may be capturing not the beginning of modern behavior, but its reconfiguration. A shift from internalized mobile systems of meaning to externalized durable ones. From memory carried in people to memory stored in things. If so, then the long gap before civilization does not reflect a delay in intelligence, It reflects a long experiment in a different mode of existence, one that functioned for tens of thousands of years, then collapsed or transformed under pressures we still struggle to fully identify. What remains unsettling is not that this mode left little behind. It is that it worked. It sustained human populations across continents, climates, and epochs without cities, writing, or permanent architecture. Whatever it was not primitive in the way the word is often used. And yet, it vanished. Or, at least, it stopped expressing itself in ways we can easily recognize. Which leaves a final question hanging in the silence of the record. If early humans were already thinking symbolically, already planning deeply, already organizing meaning beyond the individual, then what changed? What disrupted a system that endured for so long? And what was lost when it finally gave way to the world we now call civilization? Because a disappearance of behavior is rarely accidental, and it is rarely without consequence. When archaeologists map early human progress, they expect to see momentum, small improvements accumulating over time, experiments leading to refinement, complexity building unevenly but unmistakably forward. This pattern appears in many technological histories. It appears in metallurgy. It appears in agriculture. It appears in writing. But when researchers examine the deep pre-civilizational past, they encounter something far more difficult to interpret. They encounter a plateau. For extraordinarily long periods, human toolkits change very little. Stone implements are refined, yes, but within narrow boundaries. Techniques persist for thousands upon thousands of years with minimal variation. A hand axe made early in the sequence can be nearly indistinguishable from one made much later. The same forms repeat across generations, across regions, across immense spans of time. This persistence is often framed as success. If a tool works, there is no need to change it. Stability, in this view, reflects efficiency rather than stagnation. But stability at this scale is unusual. In most human systems, even effective solutions invite experimentation. Variations emerge, styles diverge, improvements are attempted, abandoned, rediscovered. Innovation rarely pauses entirely. It slows, accelerates, fragments, but it does not remain flat indefinitely. Yet here, it does. The archaeological record suggests long eras in which human technology reaches a functional equilibrium and stays there. Not for centuries, for millennia. Entire lifetimes pass without meaningful alteration to the core tools shaping daily survival. This creates a tension difficult to ignore. Because during these same periods, humans are doing things that should encourage innovation. They are expanding into new environments. They are encountering unfamiliar animals and climates. They are adapting to forests, coastlines, deserts, and ice age plains. Each new challenge would seem to invite new solutions, and yet, the solutions remain remarkably consistent. Some researchers describe this as cultural conservatism, a strong preference for inherited methods over experimentation. Others suggest that innovation occurred but was not transmitted widely enough to persist. New ideas may have emerged locally, only to vanish when individuals or small groups disappeared. Both explanations may be partially true, but neither fully explains the scale of the plateau. Because what is missing is not experimentation alone. It is accumulation. Knowledge appears to reset repeatedly. Improvements do not stack. There is little evidence of long-term technological trajectories building toward complexity. Instead, the record shows cycles of refinement and loss, advancement and forgetting. This pattern suggests a fragile system, one in which knowledge is difficult to preserve beyond immediate social networks. one in which innovation depends heavily on uninterrupted transmission across generations, one in which disruption, migration, climate stress, population decline can erase progress almost instantly. In such a system, advancement would not feel like a steady climb. It would feel like starting over, again and again. This reframes the plateau not as a lack of intelligence, but as a limitation of structure. Without durable institutions, without external memory, without stable population centers, complexity may struggle to anchor itself. Ideas exist, but they do not persist. And if that is the case, then the long technological plateau may be hiding something far more dynamic beneath its surface. Not a static humanity, but a restless one. A species constantly adapting, constantly innovating locally, yet unable to carry those innovations forward in a lasting way. Which leads to a troubling implication. If early human history is defined not by slow progress, but by repeated loss, then the gap before civilization is not simply a waiting period. It is a graveyard of forgotten advances. And the plateau itself becomes a question rather than an answer. What kind of world produces intelligence without accumulation? And what finally breaks that pattern? The plateau becomes more unsettling the longer it is examined. If technological stability reflected satisfaction, then innovation should resume smoothly when conditions change. But the archaeological record does not show smooth transitions. It shows interruptions, gaps, abrupt shifts that appear disconnected from what came immediately before. In some regions, tool complexity increases, only to vanish later. In others, sophisticated techniques appear in isolation without clear precursors. The pattern is uneven, fragmented, and difficult to align with a simple narrative of linear progress. Researchers can identify moments of ingenuity, but struggle to explain why those moments fail to propagate. This raises an uncomfortable contradiction. Humans are exceptionally good at copying success. When a method works, it spreads. When an idea offers advantage, it persists. Yet in the deep past, this principle seems strangely muted. Effective techniques do not always travel far. Innovations do not always endure. Some archaeologists suggest that early populations were too small and dispersed for reliable cultural transmission. Others point to high mortality, frequent migration, or environmental instability that prevented continuity. These explanations account for vulnerability, but not for resilience, because humans survived. They survived ice ages, megafaunal extinctions, and dramatic climate shifts. They adapted quickly to new landscapes and resources. Survival itself implies effective learning and coordination. Yet the record suggests that learning rarely accumulated in durable ways. This creates a paradox. The species demonstrates remarkable adaptability, but limited technological memory. One possible resolution is that memory itself was not technological. If knowledge was stored primarily in people rather than things, then its survival would depend entirely on social cohesion. Break the group, and the knowledge disappears. Lose the elders, and the system resets. In such a world, innovation would be fragile by default. This fragility may explain why complexity remains low despite cognitive capacity. Not because humans could not innovate, but because they could not protect innovation from loss. Still, this explanation leaves a deeper question unresolved. Why did this fragility persist for so long? At some point, humans begin to externalize memory. They mark space, they build, they record. Knowledge detaches from individuals and anchors itself in objects, locations, and later, symbols. Once that happens, accumulation becomes possible. Progress accelerates. But what delayed that shift? Why did humans tolerate a system so vulnerable to forgetting for tens of thousands of years? Why did they rely almost entirely on living memory when the consequences of loss were so severe? Researchers cannot fully explain this hesitation. Some propose that mobility discouraged permanence. Others argue that environmental unpredictability made fixed investment risky. Still others suggest that social norms actively resisted change, valuing continuity over experimentation. Each explanation offers partial insight. None fully accounts for the timing, because when the shift finally occurs, it happens quickly. Memory becomes external. Knowledge stacks. Technology diversifies. The plateau breaks. And once broken, it never truly returns. Which implies that the plateau was not inevitable. It was conditional, dependent on a specific configuration of environment, population, and social organization that persisted for an extraordinary length of time, then abruptly dissolved. If that configuration had not dissolved, civilization as we know it might never have emerged. And if it did dissolve, then something significant must have changed. Something that made forgetting more dangerous than building. Something that made permanence preferable to movement. Something that forced humanity to anchor itself to place, to structure, to material memory. The archaeological record shows the result of that change. It does not show the cause. And so the plateau remains, stretching across the deep past like a held breath. Not a sign of stagnation, but a sign of tension. A long equilibrium maintained against forces we only partially understand, until it finally gave way. And when it did, the world that emerged looked nothing like what came before. Long before walls enclosed space and streets imposed order, humans already possessed knowledge that was precise, cumulative, and difficult to acquire. Survival depended on understanding animal behavior, seasonal cycles, plant properties, weather patterns, and terrain over vast distances. This knowledge was not intuitive. It was learned, refined, and transmitted across generations. To track migrating herds requires an internal calendar. To exploit plant resources safely requires classification, memory, and experimentation. To navigate large territories demands spatial awareness that extends beyond immediate experience. These are not casual skills. They represent systems of information organized over time. And yet, these systems rarely appear to solidify into permanent settlements. For most of human history, people remain mobile. Camps are temporary. Structures are light. The landscape itself becomes the archive. Rivers mark routes. Hills anchor stories. Seasons dictate movement. Knowledge lives in repetition rather than location. Anthropologists studying recent hunter-gatherer societies note that such systems can be extraordinarily sophisticated. Entire cosmologies can be encoded in songlines, rituals, and shared narratives. Law can exist without buildings. History can persist without writing. Memory can be communal, distributed across people rather than stored in objects. In this context, cities are not a natural outcome. They are a radical departure. Cities fix people in place. They concentrate resources. They demand permanence. They require surplus, hierarchy, and coordination on a scale that transforms social relationships. For mobile societies optimized around flexibility and resilience, such rigidity may have offered little advantage. This raises a difficult question. If early humans already possessed complex knowledge systems, why abandon mobility at all? The standard answer points to agriculture. Once plants and animals are domesticated, people must stay close to their fields and herds. Settlements grow. Surplus accumulates. Cities follow. But this explanation assumes that agriculture was immediately beneficial. Evidence suggests otherwise. Early farming was labor-intensive, nutritionally limited, and risky. Hunter-gatherer diets were often more varied and resilient. Mobility allowed escape from local shortages. Fixed settlements increased exposure to disease and conflict. From this perspective, the move toward cities appears counterintuitive. It replaces flexibility with dependency. It trades adaptability for permanence. It exchanges distributed knowledge for centralized control. And yet, once it begins, it accelerates, which suggests that the decision to settle was not merely economic, it was structural. Something altered the balance between memory and materiality. Knowledge that once lived comfortably in people began to demand anchors. Traditions that survived through repetition alone became insufficient. The old systems, effective for millennia, no longer held. What caused that shift remains uncertain. Population growth may have strained oral transmission. Environmental instability may have disrupted seasonal patterns. Social complexity may have exceeded what memory alone could manage. Or perhaps the loss of earlier knowledge systems forced a change. When memory fragments, it seeks reinforcement. When tradition weakens, it hardens into ritual and structure. In that light, cities may not represent an expansion of intelligence. They may represent compensation, a response to the failure of older invisible systems that once carried human knowledge without leaving a trace. If so, then the long era before cities was not empty of order. It was ordered differently. And the absence of urban remains does not indicate an absence of complexity. It indicates a form of complexity that refused to settle, which leads to an uneasy realization. If humanity once maintained vast bodies of knowledge without cities, without writing, and without monuments, then the rise of civilization may not mark the moment we learned how to remember. It may mark the moment we realized we were starting to forget. And if forgetting was already underway, what else disappeared before the first cities ever rose? The contradiction becomes sharper when the depth of early human knowledge is fully considered. Systems capable of sustaining large populations across changing environments should, in theory, leave behind increasing layers of material evidence. Knowledge accumulates, techniques refine, traditions stabilize. Yet the archaeological record before cities remains stubbornly thin. This forces researchers to confront a paradox. Early humans knew enough to survive almost anywhere, yet chose not to anchor that knowledge in permanent form. They carried it, instead, across landscapes, across generations, across long stretches of time, without relying on structures that would preserve it beyond disruption. Such a choice suggests intention, not limitation. Some anthropologists propose that permanence was actively avoided. Fixed locations make groups predictable. Predictability invites conflict, competition, and vulnerability. Mobility disperses risk. Knowledge that lives in people can move away from danger. Knowledge locked into place cannot. If this was the logic, then early human societies may have optimized against the very things archaeologists search for. They may have minimized material accumulation precisely because it threatened long-term survival. This reframes the absence of cities as a strategy. But strategies change only when they fail. At some point, mobility and oral transmission became insufficient. Knowledge grew too complex to be held entirely in memory. Social networks expanded beyond the scale of direct familiarity. Environmental rhythms shifted faster than tradition could adapt. When that threshold was crossed, information demanded structure. And structure leaves ruins. Yet even here, another anomaly persists. The earliest cities do not appear as hesitant experiments. They do not show prolonged phases of collapse and redesign. Instead, they emerge with clear planning, social differentiation, and symbolic order. If cities were a response to crisis, then the crisis itself remains invisible. What pressure was severe enough to overturn tens of thousands of years of successful adaptation, yet left little direct trace? Climate change is often cited, so is population density, but both are gradual forces. They operate over generations. One would expect to see intermediate forms, hybrid systems combining mobility with permanence. Such forms are rare. Instead, the record shows a relatively sudden commitment to place. This suddenness suggests that the shift was not merely environmental, it was cultural. A change in how humans related to memory, to land, and to each other. A decision, conscious or otherwise, that knowledge must now be stored outside the body. Once made, this decision could not easily be reversed. Cities generate dependency. They bind people to fields, walls, and hierarchies. They demand defense, administration, and control. They reshape belief systems to justify permanence and inequality. But they also stabilize memory. They allow knowledge to outlive individuals. They enable accumulation. They protect innovation from loss. If earlier systems failed catastrophically through fragmentation, displacement, or demographic collapse, then the appeal of permanence becomes clear. Cities may not represent confidence. They may represent fear. Fear of forgetting. Fear of loss. Fear that knowledge carried only in living minds is too fragile to endure another disruption. And if that fear was justified, then something significant must have already been lost by the time the first cities rose. Not just people, but ways of knowing. Ways of organizing life that left no stone behind, and therefore no warning. Which leads to a final, unresolved tension. If civilization arose to protect knowledge from disappearance, then the gap before it may represent more than a waiting period. It may represent an earlier collapse, one so complete that its lessons survived only as instinct. And if that collapse occurred, then civilization is not humanity's first attempt at order. It is the second, built in response to a failure we can no longer see. And if that failure shaped the form civilization took, what else from that lost world still echoes in the structures we live within today? At a certain point in the record, something changes, not gradually, but decisively. Humans who have left behind little evidence of large-scale organization suddenly begin to shape stone with intention. They carve, align, transport, and erect structures that require planning far beyond the needs of daily survival. These constructions do not shelter families or store food. They do not function as villages or fortresses. They stand apart from utility. They are monuments. What makes these sites unsettling is not their size alone, but their timing. They appear before agriculture is fully established, before cities, before writing. In some cases, before permanent settlement itself. According to conventional models, they should not exist yet. To build such structures requires coordination among large groups. It requires shared symbolic purpose, authority, scheduling, and labor management. It demands knowledge of stone, landscape, and geometry. None of this emerges spontaneously. And yet, when these monuments appear, they do not look experimental. They look deliberate. The stones are shaped consistently. The layouts are intentional. The symbolism appears coherent, not random. Whatever belief system guided their construction was already mature. Whatever social structure enabled the labor was already functional. This presents a problem. If monument building represents advanced social organization, then that organization must have existed beforehand. But the material trail leading to it is faint, fragmented, or missing altogether. There is little evidence of gradual escalation toward such projects. Instead, The record offers a discontinuity. Long periods of relative invisibility followed by sudden architectural confidence. Some archaeologists interpret this as a breakthrough moment, a cultural spark that ignited new forms of expression. Others suggest that these monuments represent the first stirrings of civilization itself. But both interpretations struggle with the same question. Why here? Why then? If humans had the cognitive and social capacity to organize monumental construction, why did they refrain from doing so for so long? And why do these efforts appear almost fully formed, without clear ancestors? One possibility is that these monuments were not innovations. They were survivals, remnants of traditions that existed earlier, practiced elsewhere, and expressed through materials that did not endure. When conditions changed, when stone became the medium of choice, those traditions finally left a durable mark. If so, then monuments do not signal the beginning of complexity. They signal its first preservation. Another possibility is more unsettling, that monument building emerged not from abundance, but from anxiety. That it arose in response to disruption, environmental, social, or cultural. That humans turned to stone not because they wished to, but because they feared loss. Monuments fix memory in place. They outlast generations. They anchor, meaning when oral systems strain. They impose order on uncertainty. In that sense, a monument is not merely a structure, it is a response to something that threatened to disappear. And this interpretation aligns with a troubling pattern. Monumental construction often coincides with periods of transition, climatic shifts, demographic changes, altered subsistence strategies. Moments when old systems no longer function as they once did. If early monuments were built at the edge of collapse, then they may encode more than belief. They may encode warning. But without written records, that warning is silent. All that remains are stones arranged with care, appearing too early in the story, carrying intentions we can sense but not fully translate. They stand at the boundary between invisibility and permanence, between a world that left little trace and one that would soon leave too much. And they force a question that refuses to settle. If these monuments were not the first expressions of complex society, but the last echoes of something older, then what kind of world had already passed away by the time the stones were raised? And how much of it vanished without ever being carved into memory? Because monuments that arrive too early do not mark beginnings, they mark transitions, and transitions imply something left behind. The deeper researchers examine these early monuments, the more difficult it becomes to treat them as isolated breakthroughs. Their complexity suggests continuity rather than improvisation. Techniques appear standardized. Symbolic elements recur. Orientation toward landscape features hints at shared cosmological frameworks. These are not the products of trial and error. They are the products of familiarity. This familiarity creates a contradiction at the heart of the pre-civilizational record. Monumental construction implies long-standing social mechanisms, leadership, coordination, ritual authority. Yet the archaeological layers beneath often show little evidence of the gradual formation of such mechanisms. In many cases, the monuments stand alone. There are few domestic structures nearby, little sign of permanent habitation, no clear economic base capable of sustaining large populations year-round. This raises an unsettling question. Who built them? Temporary gatherings could account for labor, but not for consistency of design. Seasonal rituals could explain periodic assembly, but not the precision involved. The builders appear to have returned repeatedly, following established plans and shared meanings. That implies memory. Not individual memory, but collective memory sustained across time. And yet, This memory seems to emerge without an archaeological childhood. Some scholars propose that monument building preceded agriculture and may even have encouraged it, that the need to support ritual centers drove food production rather than the other way around. If true, this reverses a foundational assumption of civilization. But even this inversion leaves unanswered questions. Why did ritual demand stone? Why did symbolism suddenly require weight, permanence, and scale? Rituals existed long before monuments. Belief systems thrived without architecture. Something must have changed in how meaning was secured, something that made durability essential. This returns us to the problem of loss. If earlier symbolic systems were failing, fragmented by migration, disrupted by climate, diluted by population change, then stone becomes more than expression. It becomes insurance, a way to freeze meaning when transmission through living memory is no longer reliable. In this sense, monuments are not celebrations of stability. They are responses to instability. This interpretation casts early monument builders not as pioneers of civilization, but as guardians of continuity. People attempting to hold something together in the face of transformation they could not fully control. Yet even this attempt appears temporary. Many early monuments are eventually abandoned. Their meanings fade. Later populations reuse or ignore them. The continuity they sought to preserve does not survive intact, which suggests that whatever transition prompted their construction was profound enough to overwhelm even stone. The monuments remain. The systems behind them do not. This leaves us with a final contradiction. If monuments were built to preserve meaning, and yet failed to do so, then the loss they were responding to must have been extensive, larger than a single community, larger than a single tradition, possibly regional, possibly global. And if that loss occurred before civilization as we define it, then the origins of civilization are not rooted in growth alone. They are rooted in recovery. Recovery from fragmentation we can barely detect. Recovery from a way of life that functioned without cities, without writing, and without durable structures, until it no longer could. The stones stand at the threshold of that change, too early to belong to civilization, too deliberate to belong to simplicity. They occupy a liminal space in human history, pointing backward to something we cannot see, and forward to a world that would soon define itself by permanence. And if these monuments are echoes rather than beginnings, then the true origin of civilization lies not in construction, but in what was lost before the first stone was set. Much of what we believe about early human history rests on a dangerous assumption, that the landscapes we study today resemble the landscapes where the story unfolded. In reality, the world that early humans inhabited has been dramatically altered. Coastlines shifted, ice sheets advanced and retreated, rivers changed course. Entire regions that once supported dense human populations are now submerged or erased. During the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Vast coastal plains disappeared beneath the water. These zones were rich in resources, stable in climate, and ideal for long-term human occupation. Evidence suggests that early populations were drawn to them. But water preserves nothing easily accessible. What lies beneath modern seas remains largely unexplored, and what has been explored is fragmentary. Tools, camps, and structures that may once have existed there are now scattered, buried, or destroyed by currents and sediment. This creates a profound distortion in the archaeological record. We are studying the past through what survived, not through what mattered most. If early humans concentrated their lives along coasts and river deltas, then the disappearance of these landscapes would erase disproportionate amounts of evidence. What remains inland may represent marginal activity rather than central organization. In such a scenario, the apparent sudden rise of civilization inland becomes misleading. It would not mark the first appearance of complexity, but its relocation to higher ground. This possibility reframes the gap before civilization as a gap of visibility, not existence. Entire chapters may be missing simply because they are underwater. This is not speculation alone. Submerged stone tools, footprints, and settlements have been identified in various regions, hinting at extensive human activity now lost. But these finds are rare, expensive to access, and difficult to interpret. They offer glimpses, not narratives. And yet, even glimpses are enough to raise questions. If coastal societies existed for thousands of years, developing traditions, technologies, and social systems adapted to stable environments, then their destruction would have been catastrophic. Sea level rise was not uniform or gentle. In some periods, it accelerated rapidly, forcing displacement on timescales too short for cultural continuity. Communities would have been pushed inland, fragmented, or absorbed by others. Knowledge tied to specific places would have been rendered obsolete overnight. Memory systems anchored to vanished landscapes would lose their reference points. This kind of disruption does not leave clear archaeological signatures. It leaves confusion. And confusion looks like simplicity. The inland record that follows would show populations that appear less complex than those that preceded them, not because complexity was absent, but because it had been stripped of its foundations. If this is true, then the earliest cities and monuments may represent attempts to re-anchor society after displacement. Stone becomes a substitute for land. Architecture replaces landscape as memory. Permanence is rebuilt artificially after nature removes it. The problem is not that early human history lacks complexity. The problem is that it unfolded in places we can no longer reach, and that loss shapes every interpretation that follows. Because when the ground itself disappears, so does context, and without context, silence fills the record. Which leads to an unsettling realization. If entire cultural worlds were erased by rising seas, then civilization did not emerge from emptiness. It emerged from survivors. People carrying fragments of knowledge, belief, and practice into unfamiliar territory, forced to reconstruct meaning under pressure. And if that reconstruction appears sudden, structured, and confident, it may be because it was not invented. It was remembered imperfectly. So when we look at the gap before civilization, are we seeing the absence of history or the aftermath of a world that was swallowed whole? The contradiction deepens when the scale of landscape loss is fully considered. The periods of greatest environmental upheaval coincide uncomfortably well with the gaps in the human record. Just as population should be leaving behind increasing traces of organization, the physical settings most likely to preserve those traces are disappearing. Archaeology, by necessity, privileges what remains accessible. Dry caves, upland plains, and stone-rich regions dominate our understanding of early humanity, not because they were central, but because they endured. What they preserve may be exceptional rather than representative. This creates a selection bias that is difficult to escape. If early complexity clustered in low-lying, resource-dense environments, then its disappearance would leave behind a distorted picture. Mobile inland groups appearing technologically conservative, while the more stable and innovative centers vanish beneath the sea. In this context, the long plateau and sudden acceleration take on new meaning. The plateau may reflect the survival of peripheral strategies, not the absence of innovation. The acceleration may mark the moment when displaced populations were forced to reestablish complexity in environments capable of preserving it. But this raises another anomaly. If displacement was widespread, why do we not see clearer signs of cultural trauma? Why does the archaeological record not show prolonged collapse, chaos, or regression before the rise of cities? One answer may lie in how collapse manifests when memory systems are oral and distributed. Loss does not always appear as destruction. It appears as simplification, as narrowing, as the abandonment of practices that no longer function in new settings. The inland societies that emerge after major environmental shifts may represent not a fresh start, but a stripped-down version of something older. Complex knowledge becomes difficult to apply. Traditions lose relevance. Only what can be carried easily survives. This process would leave behind a record that looks deceptively clean. No ruins, no burned cities, just absence. And absence is easy to misinterpret. The problem is compounded by the fact that archaeology often treats early cities as points of origin rather than points of convergence. Multiple populations, displaced from different regions, may have brought fragments of tradition together in shared locations. What appears as sudden innovation could be synthesis. This would explain why early civilizations often show advanced organization without clear local precursors. The precursors existed, but elsewhere, and are now gone. Yet this explanation remains incomplete, because even synthesis requires memory. It requires that displaced groups retain enough coherence to contribute meaningfully to a new whole. It requires that something survived the upheaval intact. What that something was is difficult to define. It does not appear as a continuous technological lineage. It does not appear as a stable architectural tradition. It appears instead as an underlying readiness for complexity, a familiarity with organization that reasserts itself when conditions allow. Researchers struggle to measure such readiness. It leaves no clear artifact. And so the record oscillates between two unsatisfying extremes. Either early humans repeatedly invented complexity from near nothing, or complexity existed in forms that were systematically erased. Neither explanation sits comfortably. But the second aligns more closely with the pattern of sudden reappearance, practiced forms, and rapid accumulation that follows the gap. If landscapes can disappear, then so can histories. And if histories can disappear, then the foundation of civilization rests not on a blank slate, but on fragments salvaged from a world that no longer exists. This reframes the gap before civilization as a boundary shaped by geology as much as by culture. Not a beginning, a shoreline. One side submerged, the other preserved. And we are standing on the wrong side of it, trying to reconstruct what lies beneath without the benefit of ground beneath our feet. If the earliest human worlds are underwater, then every origin story we tell begins halfway through, and the first half may never be fully recovered. Before writing fixed words in place, before stone and clay were asked to remember for us, history lived in people. It moved through voices, gestures, ritual, and repetition. Knowledge was not stored, it was performed. Each generation became both archive and messenger, carrying forward what mattered by reenacting it. In such worlds, memory was not passive. It was active, disciplined, and communal. Stories were structured to resist forgetting. Myths encoded geography. Songs preserved roots, seasons, and law. Genealogies mapped obligation and identity. What could not be remembered accurately did not survive. Anthropologists studying recent oral cultures have noted that these systems are not crude approximations of written history. They are precise within their own logic. When properly maintained, they can preserve information for astonishing lengths of time. But they demand continuity. They require stable transmission, intact social bonds, and unbroken chains of teaching. And that is where their strength becomes vulnerability. Oral systems do not fail gradually. They fail suddenly. when populations fragment, when elders are lost, when displacement severs people from the landscapes their stories describe, memory does not adapt easily. A song tied to a vanished river loses its reference. A ritual anchored to a flooded coastline loses its meaning. Once repetition breaks, accuracy collapses. Nothing marks this collapse materially. There are no ruins of forgotten stories, no layers of abandoned language. The loss leaves no scar in the ground. It leaves only silence. This makes oral worlds almost invisible to archaeology. They can sustain complexity for millennia, yet disappear in a single generation without leaving behind more than scattered tools and camps. To an excavator thousands of years later, such a society looks simple, not because it was, but because its memory died intact, without residue. This fragility becomes critical when viewed against the backdrop of repeated disruption in early human history. Climate shifts, rising seas, migration, population bottlenecks. Each event threatens the continuity oral systems depend upon. Each one increases the risk that knowledge accumulated over generations will simply vanish. If early human societies relied primarily on oral transmission, then the gap before civilization may reflect repeated memory collapse rather than intellectual delay. Entire traditions could have risen, flourished, and vanished without ever hardening into matter. In this context, writing and architecture take on a different meaning. They are not expressions of confidence. They are defenses against loss. External memory emerges when internal memory can no longer be trusted to survive disruption. But this shift comes at a cost. When memory moves into objects, it becomes less flexible. It detaches from lived experience. Authority shifts from elders to records, from practice to preservation. What is gained in durability is lost in adaptability. This trade-off suggests that early humans did not avoid writing and permanence because they lacked imagination. They avoided it because they did not yet need it. Oral worlds function best when the world itself remains legible, when landscapes endure, when populations remain connected, when disruption is limited. Once that legibility breaks down, memory seeks reinforcement, and reinforcement leaves traces. Which raises a quiet but unsettling thought. If the archaeological record begins to thicken only after oral systems repeatedly fail, then what we call the dawn of civilization may actually mark the point at which humanity could no longer rely on memory alone. Not because it had nothing to remember, but because it had already lost too much. And if entire histories vanished with the last voices that carried them, how many human worlds ended without ever knowing they were being forgotten? The contradiction at the heart of oral worlds is subtle but profound. Systems capable of preserving complex knowledge for millennia can nonetheless collapse without leaving a trace. From the perspective of archaeology, this collapse is indistinguishable from simplicity. What disappears cleanly is easily mistaken for what never existed. This creates a methodological blind spot. The more effective an oral system is at avoiding material accumulation, the less visible it becomes to later observers. A society that remembers everything in people leaves almost nothing behind. A society that forgets begins to build. In this light, the appearance of writing, record-keeping, and monumental memory does not necessarily indicate a leap in intelligence. It may indicate a loss of trust in memory, in continuity, in the ability of living systems to preserve what matters. Yet here another anomaly emerges. If oral systems were failing repeatedly, we might expect early writing to show signs of desperation, fragmentation, or improvisation. Instead, the earliest written systems appear structured, symbolic, and governed by conventions. They are not raw attempts at memory preservation. They are already abstract. This suggests that the idea of externalized memory was not entirely new when writing emerged. The concept may have existed long before, even if its material expression did not survive. Marking, tallying, symbolic representation, these behaviors could have been practiced in perishable forms. Knots, carvings on wood, painted skins, temporary markings in earth. All would vanish without a trace. If such practices existed, then writing represents not an invention, but a migration of existing concepts into more durable media. Once again, the pattern repeats. Familiarity without ancestry. Complexity without visible preparation. This repetition hints at something deeper than coincidence. It suggests that human culture may have long operated at levels of abstraction that we systematically underestimate because they did not align with durability. Intelligence was present, structure was present, meaning was present. What was absent was survivability. And survivability becomes critical only after enough loss accumulates. This reframes the gap before civilization as a pressure gradient. Each disruption erodes memory. Each erosion increases the incentive to externalize knowledge. Eventually, the threshold is crossed. Civilization begins not when humans become capable of writing, but when they become unwilling to risk forgetting again. Yet even this explanation does not resolve everything, because oral systems do not fail everywhere at once. If collapse were local, why does externalized memory appear in multiple regions within relatively narrow windows? Why do cities, writing, and monuments emerge in clusters rather than isolation? Some researchers suggest that widespread environmental stress created simultaneous conditions of loss across distant populations. Others argue that population growth strained oral transmission beyond its limits. Still, others point to increasing intergroup contact, making shared memory harder to maintain without standardization. Each proposal has merit. None can be proven conclusively. What remains is a pattern of convergence. Different regions, different cultures, similar responses. External memory appears when internal memory can no longer guarantee continuity. But if that is the case, then the gap before civilization was not empty. It was crowded with stories that did not survive, crowded with laws that were never written, crowded with histories that ended cleanly, without ruins. And the archaeological silence we struggle to interpret may be the echo of an extraordinary success, followed by an irreversible failure. A world where memory worked until it didn't. And when it stopped working, humanity began to build in stone, in clay, and in symbols that could outlast the voice. If civilization is a response to forgetting, then every written word carries the shadow of something already lost. After the long silence, the pattern shifts. Human history, which had unfolded slowly and unevenly for tens of thousands of years, begins to move at a different pace. Settlements expand, architecture multiplies, technologies diversify, symbols proliferate. Within what is, archaeologically speaking, a remarkably short span of time, societies emerge that look unmistakably complex. This change is often described as a revolution. Agriculture spreads, cities appear, writing follows. Trade networks extend across regions, social hierarchies harden. The human world becomes dense with structure. What is striking is not that this happens, but how quickly it happens. Compared to the vast plateau that precedes it, the acceleration feels compressed, almost abrupt. Practices that require planning across generations become common. Institutions stabilize. Memory anchors itself in objects and spaces. Complexity no longer flickers and disappears. It accumulates. The contrast is stark. For millennia, innovation struggled to persist. Now it stacks. Ideas build on one another. Techniques refine rapidly, cultural systems begin to reinforce themselves rather than reset. Researchers often attribute this shift to agriculture, surplus, and population density. With more food comes stability. With stability comes specialization. With specialization comes innovation. But this explanation risks circularity. Agriculture itself requires planning, coordination, and long-term commitment. It demands knowledge of seasons, soil, and cycles. It assumes a willingness to invest in futures that may not materialize. These are not simple decisions. They reflect a mindset already comfortable with delayed returns and abstract systems, which raises an uncomfortable question. Where did that mindset come from? If humans spent tens of thousands of years operating within fragile, memory-based systems, then the sudden confidence to lock knowledge into land, to bind communities to place, and to accept dependency on stored resources suggests a prior familiarity with complexity, not a sudden awakening. The acceleration looks less like invention and more like release, as if constraints that once suppressed accumulation had lifted. Population growth may have reached a tipping point. Environmental conditions may have stabilized briefly. Displaced groups may have converged. Oral systems may have reached their limits. Whatever the cause, something changed the balance between loss and preservation. Once preservation became reliable, complexity no longer had to fight forgetting. And when forgetting recedes, history accelerates. This framing recasts the so-called Neolithic Revolution not as a creative explosion, but as a structural shift. The underlying capacities were already there. What changed was the ability to hold on to them. Still, this interpretation carries its own tension. If acceleration depends on preservation, then why did preservation not emerge earlier? Why did humanity endure such long vulnerability to loss before finally externalizing memory and organization at scale? The answer remains elusive, but the pattern is unmistakable. After the gap, humanity does not hesitate. It builds quickly. It organizes aggressively. It reshapes landscapes and social relations with confidence. There is little evidence of doubt, little sense of tentative exploration. The systems that emerge are not fragile experiments. They are assertive, which suggests that civilization did not begin as a question. It began as an answer to pressures that are no longer visible, to losses that no longer speak, to failures that left no ruins behind. And that makes the acceleration itself a clue. Because when a species changes this quickly, it is rarely because it has discovered something entirely new. It is because it can no longer afford to live the old way. So what finally made the long equilibrium of the past untenable and forced humanity to move faster than it ever had before? The acceleration becomes more puzzling when its internal consistency is examined. Across different regions, societies adopt similar solutions to the problem of permanence. They settle, they build, they record, they stratify. The specifics vary, but the structural choices converge. This convergence suggests constraint rather than coincidence. If civilization were simply an invention, one would expect greater diversity in its earliest forms. Instead, we see repeated patterns: centralized authority, monumental architecture, formalized belief systems, surplus management. These elements appear together, reinforcing one another. They behave like components of a system that must be adopted as a whole. This raises a contradiction. If early humans were free to choose among countless social configurations, why do they repeatedly arrive at similar ones? Why does complexity take this particular shape rather than countless others? One possibility is that these forms were already familiar, that humans were not inventing from scratch, but reassembling known structures under new conditions. The rapidity with which institutions stabilize supports this view. Trial and error phases are brief or absent. Systems lock in quickly. This again implies memory. Not individual memory, but cultural memory. Patterns retained even when their original contexts are lost. Instinctive preferences for hierarchy, permanence, and control may reflect long experience with their absence. Another anomaly lies in the costs of acceleration. Early civilizations pay a price for speed. Diets narrow, disease increases, inequality sharpens. Environmental degradation begins almost immediately. These are not hidden consequences. They are visible in bones, settlements, and landscapes. Yet societies persist with these choices. They do not revert. Even when early cities collapse, later ones rise in similar forms. The basic template endures. This persistence suggests that once externalized systems of memory and control are adopted, abandoning them becomes difficult, perhaps impossible. If so, then the acceleration marks a point of no return, a commitment to permanence that trades flexibility for accumulation. Why make such a trade unless the alternative has become intolerable? This returns us to the unresolved question of what preceded the acceleration. If earlier systems repeatedly failed through fragmentation, displacement, or forgetting, then the costs of civilization may have been judged acceptable by comparison. Civilization, in this view, is not a triumph. It is a compromise, one that locks humanity into a narrow path, constraining future options in exchange for stability and continuity. This interpretation also explains why the gap before civilization remains so difficult to illuminate. The systems that preceded it were optimized for survival, not preservation. When they failed cleanly. What follows is a world built to prevent that kind of failure from happening again, and it works. Once established, civilization accumulates history relentlessly. It records victories and collapses alike. It leaves behind ruins, texts, and scars. Forgetting becomes harder. But memory, once externalized, also becomes selective. What is written survives. What is not written fades. Oral worlds retreat into myth. Earlier ways of life become framed as primitive, even when they sustained humanity far longer than cities ever have. In this way, acceleration does more than change pace. It rewrites perception. The long gap before civilization becomes a blank space, a prelude, a waiting room. Not because nothing happened there, but because the new system of memory does not recognize what it cannot record. And so the contradiction remains. Civilization accelerates history, but narrows it. It preserves, but also erases. And the faster it moves forward, the harder it becomes to look back at what came before without distortion. If acceleration is a response to loss, then what we gained in speed may have cost us the ability to see our own beginnings clearly. Every reconstruction of the deep past rests on a fragile foundation. The assumption that what survives is representative of what once existed. Archaeology works outward from fragments, assembling narratives from what endures longest. Stone speaks loudly. Bone whispers. Everything else is mostly silent. This imbalance shapes the story we tell. Materials that decay, wood, fiber, hide, plant matter, once formed the bulk of human life. Shelters, tools, clothing, containers, musical instruments, memory aids, ritual objects. Entire worlds were built from substances designed to return to the earth. Their disappearance is not evidence of absence. It is the expected outcome. Yet interpretation often forgets this. What remains becomes central. What vanishes becomes peripheral. Over time, the record begins to imply that early humans invested little in complexity simply because complexity does not survive in durable form. This creates a subtle distortion. Imagine a society that builds nothing permanent, records nothing in stone, and organizes knowledge entirely through living systems. To its members, it may feel richly structured, ordered, and meaningful. To archaeology, it appears thin, scattered, and incomplete. Now imagine that this society persists for thousands of years, then disappears through migration, assimilation, or environmental change. Nothing collapses, nothing burns, nothing is abandoned dramatically. There is nothing to find. This is the kind of disappearance the archaeological record struggles most to register. Catastrophe leaves traces. Gradual erasure does not. The gap before civilization may be filled with exactly this kind of loss. Not the fall of cities, but the quiet ending of ways of life that were never designed to endure materially. When those systems ended, they did not leave ruins. They left silence. This silence is often interpreted as simplicity, but simplicity is an inference, not an observation. The record tells us what survived. It does not tell us what structured daily life, what governed relationships, what organized meaning. Those dimensions must be inferred cautiously, yet they are often flattened by necessity. This is why the emergence of civilization feels sudden. It is not only because complexity increases, but because complexity finally begins to leave evidence in forms we recognize. Writing, architecture, durable tools, these create visibility. What comes before remains largely invisible. The danger lies in mistaking invisibility for non-existence. When archaeologists speak of a record, they speak of a partial archive shaped by chemistry, geology, and chance. The absence of evidence is not evenly distributed. It clusters around certain materials, environments, and behaviors. Early human societies that favored mobility, organic materials, and oral memory were effectively writing their history on water. Civilization writes on stone, and stone remembers selectively, which leads to a critical tension. If the record cannot speak clearly about the majority of human history, then the gap before civilization may be less a mystery of origins and more a boundary of method, a place where our tools for knowing reach their limits. And when method fails, narrative fills the space. Narrative simplifies, it compresses, it creates beginnings and endings where there may have been only transitions. This makes the gap before civilization appear empty, but emptiness, in this case, may be an illusion created by what cannot survive long enough to be found. If so, then the most consequential chapters of human history may not be missing because they were insignificant, but because they were lived lightly. And if that is true, then the record's silence is not neutral. It is biased toward a particular kind of humanity, one that builds to last, one that leaves scars, one that comes late. And if the record favors what endures, how much of humanity's past has already been filtered out before we ever begin to ask questions? The contradiction becomes unavoidable when the scale of human time is compared to the scale of human evidence. Anatomically, modern humans have existed far longer than the period in which durable traces dominate the record. For most of our history, the ground beneath us remembers almost nothing. And yet, we know that people were there. They crossed continents. They adapted to extremes. They survived repeated upheaval. Such feats require organization, foresight, and shared understanding. The absence of material complexity sits uneasily beside the presence of behavioral sophistication. This tension has led some researchers to caution against treating the archaeological record as a complete narrative. It is not a continuous film. It is a collection of still frames taken at irregular intervals, often from the least representative locations. When these frames are assembled into a sequence, they create the illusion of sudden appearance. Civilization seems to emerge abruptly because the preceding scenes were never captured. But this explanation introduces another anomaly. If complexity existed but failed to preserve itself, why do we see recurring structural similarities when it finally becomes visible? Why do early civilizations across different regions organize themselves in comparable ways? One answer is constraint. Certain social solutions may be more stable than others under conditions of density and permanence. Hierarchy, centralization, and symbolic authority may simply work better once societies reach a certain scale. But this does not fully resolve the question, because the ease with which humans adopt these solutions suggests familiarity. They do not appear to struggle to invent governance, ritual, or administration. These elements coalesce rapidly, often with remarkable coherence. This coherence implies that the concepts were already available, even if their earlier expressions were ephemeral. If so, then the record is not hiding complexity so much as misplacing it. What we see as beginnings may actually be translations, old ideas rendered in new materials. This perspective forces a reevaluation of how absence is interpreted. The lack of ruins does not necessarily indicate a lack of structure. It may indicate a different relationship to durability. In some cases, the most enduring systems are those that leave the fewest traces. This possibility unsettles conventional chronologies. It suggests that the sequence from simple to complex may be an artifact of preservation rather than reality. Complexity may have risen and fallen multiple times, expressed in ways that archaeology struggles to detect. Researchers cannot confirm this, but they cannot rule it out either. The record allows for the possibility of forgotten complexity, and that possibility reshapes the meaning of the gap. Instead of a blank prelude, it becomes a zone of uncertainty, a region where evidence thins and interpretation becomes increasingly speculative, a place where confidence should diminish, not increase. Yet narratives often move in the opposite direction. The further back in time we go, the more absolute our labels become: Paleolithic, Neolithic, pre-civilized. These categories impose order where the record cannot support it. They suggest clear boundaries where there may have been only gradations. The gap before civilization may therefore be less a factual divide than a conceptual one. A line drawn where evidence becomes difficult, not where humanity fundamentally changed. If so, then civilization is not a clean break. It is a shift in visibility, a moment when human activity begins to align with what the ground is capable of remembering. And everything before that, no matter how complex, how organized, how meaningful, fades into an archaeological twilight. If the past we can see is only the past that survived, then the history we tell may be shaped less by what happened than by what could not endure. At the far edge of the record, after tools and monuments, after memory hardens into text and stone, the gap still remains. It does not close. It does not resolve. It lingers beneath every origin story like a pressure fault beneath the ground. Despite decades of excavation, refinement, and debate, researchers continue to confront the same problem. The foundations of civilization appear incomplete. The earliest cities rise without clear ancestors. Writing emerges already abstract. Social hierarchies solidify with remarkable speed. What should be a long developmental slope often looks like a ledge. This does not mean that scholars are careless or incurious. On the contrary, the gap has been examined repeatedly from every available angle. Environmental models, demographic theories, cognitive explanations, economic pressures, all have been applied. Each explains something. None explains everything. What remains troubling is not a single missing link, but a pattern of absence. Preparation appears insufficient. Transitions appear compressed. The archaeological record seems to skip steps that logic suggests should be present. This has led some researchers to adopt a cautious language. Civilization is described not as an invention, but as an emergence, not as a beginning, but as a threshold. These words acknowledge uncertainty without resolving it. A threshold implies crossing, but crossing from where? If civilization marks the point at which complexity becomes durable, then everything before it exists in a different state, one that does not translate easily into ruins and records, a state optimized for survival rather than remembrance. In this view, the gap is not empty, it is opaque. Humanity's longest chapter may be written in materials that time refuses to keep. It may be structured around relationships, movement, and memory rather than walls and words. It may have functioned effectively for tens of thousands of years before giving way under pressures we can only partially reconstruct. What unsettles this interpretation is its implication. If civilization arose not because humanity suddenly became capable, but because earlier systems failed, then progress is not a straight line. It is a series of adaptations to loss. And loss does not announce itself. It erases quietly. The earliest cities, then, may not represent confidence in the future, but anxiety about continuity. Writing may not signal intellectual triumph, but fear of forgetting. Monuments may not celebrate beginnings, but attempt to hold something together that was already slipping away. This perspective does not diminish civilization. It complicates it. It suggests that what we call origins may actually be responses, that the visible world of history is built atop invisible ruins, that the gap before civilization is not a void to be filled, but a boundary beyond which our methods falter. And that boundary still matters, because every time we describe early humanity as waiting, as primitive, as incomplete, we project modern expectations backward into a past that may have been ordered in ways we no longer recognize. The gap resists closure because it is not merely a problem of missing data. It is a problem of perspective. We are looking for permanence in a world that may have avoided it. We are searching for accumulation in a history shaped by forgetting and renewal. We are asking stone to remember what was never meant to last. And stone remains silent. If the gap before civilization cannot be closed, then perhaps it was never meant to be. And what we call the beginning may simply be the point where the past becomes visible enough for us to mistake it for an origin. The final contradiction is the simplest and the most difficult to resolve. Civilization defines history by what it preserves. Everything before it is judged by the same standard, even though it did not play by the same rules. What survives becomes central. What vanishes becomes marginal. Over time, this imbalance hardens into certainty, but certainty here is misleading. If the deep human past was organized around mobility, oral memory, and perishable materials, then it was never designed to be legible to us. Its success would be measured in continuity of life, not continuity of objects. Its collapse, if collapse occurred, would leave no dramatic horizon layer, only thinning traces and eventual silence. This creates a paradox that archaeology cannot fully escape. The more effective early systems were at sustaining life without permanence, the less likely they are to be recognized as complex. The more lightly humans lived on the land, the less history they appear to have. Civilization, by contrast, announces itself loudly. It scars landscapes. It piles memory into stone and text. It insists on being remembered. And because it remembers itself so well, it becomes the reference point for everything else. This raises an uncomfortable question. What if civilization is not humanity's natural state, but an emergency adaptation? a solution to repeated loss, a mechanism to prevent forgetting in a world that had become too unstable for memory alone. If that is the case, then the gap before civilization is not a prelude, it is a different equilibrium, one that lasted far longer. And if it lasted longer, it deserves to be taken seriously. Researchers cannot say with confidence how many times complexity may have arisen and vanished before leaving durable marks. They cannot rule out cycles of organization followed by erasure. They cannot determine how much knowledge was lost when landscapes disappeared, populations fragmented, or oral systems collapsed. What they can say is this: the record we possess is incomplete by design, not by negligence, by physics, by decay, by the fact that most human life was lived in ways that do not fossilize. This means the gap before civilization is not simply an absence waiting to be filled with future discoveries. It may be a permanent feature of our understanding, a region where certainty dissolves and inference must remain cautious. And that may be the most honest conclusion available. Not that we do not know yet, but that we may never know fully. Civilization begins where memory becomes external, where loss becomes intolerable, where history insists on being written down. Everything before that exists in a different register, one that resists excavation, classification, and closure. The gap remains because it is real, not as emptiness, but as inaccessibility. A reminder that humanity's longest story unfolded without asking to be remembered by stone. And perhaps that is the final irony. The age that built monuments and records defines itself as history. The age that sustained humanity for tens of thousands of years becomes prehistory, not because it lacked meaning, but because it trusted memory, and memory failed quietly. So the gap endures, not as a problem to be solved, but as a boundary to be respected, a space where certainty gives way to humility, and where the question that opened this journey remains unanswered. If civilization is what survives, then what kind of humanity thrived before survival became the goal? And what else about our origins remains hidden, not because it never existed, but because it was never meant to last?